Hi everyone, this is Danielle. I'm recording a video on, as you can see from the title, selecting an appropriate narrow topic for, I have here the annotated bibliography and the classical argument paper, but this can also be for the um, problem solution paper in this course, and also just for really any research paper that you do in any class. So this is really what we call a transferable skill set that I'm trying to teach. So because selecting a topic is not always the easiest thing to do. So I did want to address this because I've had a lot of issues with this in the past, particularly with English 123. This is the first time I'm making this type of video for this particular course, but I wanted to address it before the annotated bibliography because with the annotated bib, the annotated bib is one of the first assignments that is part of the classical argument overall assignment. So the classical argument has a variety of smaller assignments doing what's called scaffolding. So you do like these small, quote unquote, smaller assignments that lead into this argumentative research paper that culminates in the final version of the classical argument paper. So, and the annotated bibliography is one of those. So, the topic you choose for the annotated bibliography is the topic that you use for the classical argument paper. So, that's why I wanted to record this video during the module that you are actually engaging in and doing the annotated bib. So I have a couple things that I want to address, and I'm going to just briefly talk about like what is a classical argument. I'm going to start with that, going over kind of how do you know your argument is an argument. I'm going to talk about the introduction itself because the introduction, I don't think students understand the intense rhetorical purposes of an introduction. There's a lot of stress and complexities that the introduction it has to do a lot of work, the introduction, and um, I'd say probably 85 to 90% of students in English 123 do not necessarily understand or are aware or might be a little confused as to how to do those things, do the work in the introduction that needs to be done in the introduction. So that's also part of it because when I give feedback on the classical argument draft, I spend a long time giving feedback on the introduction, which is a really important paragraph because it's setting up the whole rest of the paper. And if you don't have your introduction set up well, that's a big problem. So, firstly, what is a classical argument? This won't take long to go over. A classical argument should be something that most of you probably have written in at some point in the past in terms of the genre of this type of writing. It is what we call just academic argumentation. It's pretty standard, so it's got that very formal intro with a thesis. Just in this case, it's an argumentative thesis. Sometimes you'll hear me juxtapose argumentation. There's argumentation versus what we call informational or expository writing. So when we do informational or expository writing, which you've done some of that writing in this class, usually we just call it expository writing, like I've taught expository writing. That type of writing is just where you're writing informational type of writing, and there's a specific way to do that type of writing. It's just that it's taking out the argument, but argument is really the scholarly type of writing, and that's the type of writing you do in university composition courses, and it's meant to set you up for the various type of argumentative writing that you're expected to be, that you will be doing in a lot of the other classes that you'll be taking throughout your time at Embry-Riddle. So it has that intro with the thesis, and like I said, the intro has a lot of work to do. It also has a lot of work to do that leads into the thesis. The thesis is not this standalone sentence at the end of the introduction. It's got those body paragraphs that have subclaims that support the thesis, and then it has a conclusion that offers further thought, and I'll get into that further thought later. So that's just a classical argument. There's no variance in terms of the organization to how it works. The problem solution paper, which comes after this, you'll see and what that means is I'm talking about the organization in terms of how the classical argument is organized. The classical is talking about the organization of it. So the organization of the argumentation is very standard. You have the intro with the thesis, the body paragraphs with the subclaims that support the overall thesis, and you have a conclusion. The problem solution paper has a different organization. It's not a classical style organization. So, but the classical argument, we start with that because it's conventional, and then we move into a type of argumentative organization that is different, which is not unusual to do in a composition class. I have taught composition for 17 years, and it's not unusual to do a standard type of argument like this and then do a different organized type of argumentation on top of that. So, and this isn't bolded, that's driving me crazy. So in terms of one thing that happens a lot in these final two papers, because like I said, a lot of these because both final papers, the classical argument and the problem solution paper, are argument papers, and even though the problem solution paper is organized differently, there's still a thesis statement there, and it's still argumentative. But particularly with the classical argument paper, there's a lot of times where there's either no thesis statement or there's what we call an implied thesis statement, which means it's like the reader can kind of pull out or infer a thesis statement, even though it's not explicitly stated, it's implicit, which is not ideal. It should be explicitly stated. But at the end of the day, the argument should be an argument. And there's a lot of times where the argument is not an argument, and instead there's this informational or expository thesis rather than an argumentative thesis. So that's sometimes where students struggle with the type of thesis statement that they're writing for the classical argument paper. So how do you know if your argument is an argument? And in feedback, I try to challenge students by bringing this up. Like, you're making this point, but there's no argument to it. And also in the classical argument paper, you have to explicitly address the counter argument or the opposition and then refute that. And it's like, what is your counter argument to this? Like, if you have no opposition, then how is this an argument? So that's the whole premise, right? So your argument is an argument if it has a genuine opposition. So if not, then you're just kind of talking for the sake of talking. And that's where it gets into that kind of other genre of writing. So you're leaving the classical argument or just the argumentation genre, and you're moving into the informational expository genre, which is going into another genre, which means you're no longer fulfilling the criteria of this assignment. And so that's a problem in and of itself. But you have to make sure that your argument has an opposition. So someone or multiple, there could be one major opposition, or there might be more than one. Sometimes there's two, sometimes there's three. Um, multiple opposing sides, but there has to be at least one major opposing side that can come in and say, there is this major opposition to the argument that you're putting forth, right? And that's what distinguishes between the expository genre, the informational genre, um, the informational thesis versus the argumentative thesis. And if you don't have that for the thesis, you're not going to be able to do that with a counter argument, because and you'd be surprised how often that happens. And it's like, when I see that in the introduction, I'm like, I don't know how they're going to bring up the counter argument, and lo and behold, they don't, because they can't, because the entire thing is then written like a blog. It's just written like and I'll get to it, and it's probably better for me to talk about it when I actually talk about topics that are problematic, but it ends up being written like a blog. Like, let me talk about, this issue and why it's a problem, right? So you want to make sure that your argument is actually an argument. Things to watch out for in the introduction. I'm also going to give you this handout that I've kind of crafted up as well. So when I talk about like the rhetorical work of an introduction in terms of what it has to do a lot. It's not easy. Lack of forecasting. You have to forecast in your thesis or in your introduction. So what is forecasting? So forecasting means that you are letting your reader know in your introduction everything that you plan on discussing or touching on in the entire paper. You just don't fully develop it in your introduction. You kind of mention it. What you want to avoid is these kind of mysteries or surprises in the rest of the paper, because academic writing is not a mystery novel. It's not a whodunit. It's not like, oh, you're talking about this now. You didn't mention that in your introduction. Right, so forecasting is, these are the things that I plan on talking about. You don't have to say it like that, right? But you have to bring up what you plan on talking about and justifying why it's important to talk about those things. Not carving a space for your argument. One of the most important things to do in an introduction is carving a space for your argument. This has to do with what I talk about down here, which is this metaphor of the Burkean parlor. So I'm actually going to save this bullet point for that. So having a disconnected thesis, this is a very common thing that I see in student papers. So the disconnected thesis statement is essentially where you have, so the thesis statement, right, is that sentence that goes at the end of the introduction. And then there's text, right, that goes above the thesis statement. So there's the introduction, and then you have the thesis statement. So a disconnected thesis statement is where there's information and then the thesis statement, and none of the information that precedes the thesis statement has anything to do with the thesis statement. So the thesis statement is actually a recap, or that's a recapitulation of everything you've already said. The thesis statement might feel redundant. It might feel like you're repeating information, but the thesis statement should already be everything you've already talked about in the introduction. If you're going on in your introduction, and then you go to your thesis statement and you're now for the first time mentioning things, that's then a disconnected thesis. You haven't prepared, you haven't done the work that you've needed to do in your introduction to prep for that thesis statement. It's like a whoa, wait a minute. I'm not ready for that thesis statement. Nothing in your introduction has prepped me as your reader for what you just gave me in that last sentence. So the thesis statement is a formalized one sentence that should repeat information that you've already provided, that condenses everything into one concise, sometimes it's a very long sentence, sometimes it's 2 sentences, but usually it's one long formal sentence that has everything in it that lets the reader know, okay, that's everything you just said, all in nice one compact sentence that I can now comprehend. So you want to make sure you don't have that disconnected thesis statement. Making sure you have a thesis statement. I see a lot of student papers that just don't have thesis statements. So that's a problem in and of itself. And again, I've already talked about this, making sure that you have an argumentative thesis statement. A thing about length, and I also bring in something about evidence here. Just to give a tip about length, because I think maybe some students have questions about this and I never address it. Length of introductions has to do with length of papers. So the longer the paper, the longer the introduction. If you're writing a 20-page paper, right, the introduction is going to be several pages long. If you're writing a book, right, that's going to be, 10, 15 pages long. When you have the length of what we're writing, what is it, 750 something words, your intro should be about 3/4 of a page in length. If you're writing anything shorter than that, I mean, if it's a half a page, like that's cutting it. It shouldn't be shorter than that at all. And I am talking about double spaced. So, but it should be about 3/4 of a page because, like I said, the intro has a lot of work to do. So there's the space, and then 3/4 of a page. That's the length of all the work that needs to be done in this type of intro for this type of paper. That's the length, and the length of the paper, that's how long an intro for this type of paper should be. And I also say effective intros should include brief evidence to offer ethos or credibility to your argument. It's very common in effective writing that intros include very brief evidence that help to not only support their own arguments or give an evidence that like a problem is actually a problem, or help to provide or offer like statistics or a wide variety. There's a wide variety because when you get into this type of argumentation, the sky is kind of the limit sort of thing. But also evidence of the opposition, which is my next bullet point. Because that helps to establish ethos for you as a writer. Because if you're leaving evidence out in your introduction, at that point, you're saying, hey, reader, just trust me. I know what I'm talking about. And you're asking the reader to kind of take a leap of faith with you. And that's not great. So unless you sound really, really fantastic and like you really, really know what you're talking about, it's okay, but I mean, it always sounds better. I'm just telling you what a best practice is. And it doesn't take a whole lot of space to drop in a little piece of evidence here and a little piece of evidence there in an introduction, just to help bolster your ethos and that also helps to carve a space for your argument as well as the opposition. So again, my next bullet point, like I said, is offering a brief snippet or brief snippets of the opposition in the intro, right? Because to talk about an argument, you have to also mention the opposition. Because to identify something as an issue, you have to kind of explain, like, this is the issue. There's this, and then there's these other people who think this, but here's why this, right? So mentioning the opposition is something you have to reconcile. You have to address it. And so talking about that in the intro helps. It makes it known that you're familiar with the opposition, that you're knowledgeable about it, including evidence about it is helpful. Again, it helps to build your ethos as a writer, and it also helps to carve that space for your argument. Okay, now I'm going to get into this. I know it's long, but it is important because it is really about what the heck we're doing when we're writing in these types of weird genres like classical arguments. Don't forget, you're not the first to talk about this, right? So you're entering a large conversation. And this is why we do research as a pre-writing practice. Research is actually the only pre-writing practice I do. I do nothing else. Once I'm in actual writing, like drafting, I might do free writing if I get writer's block. But research is it. I just want to know what everyone else is saying so I can be knowledgeable and I don't look stupid. So research is all I do as my pre-writing practice, and I take extensive notes on research. I keep extensive documents on what research I'm looking at. I pull quotations. I do what's called active reading. So I document, I looked at this source, I craft a citation, I pull quotations, I put in-text citations, I'll even write signposts for them so I can contextualize the quotations so I know who's saying what and why it's important. I do all of that because that's working smarter, not harder. So if I end up wanting to use one of those quotations later on, I've got it all set up and ready to go. I just drag and drop, drag and drop, drag and drop. So that's why we do the annotated bit first. This is called the research terrain. And you want to know what this larger conversation is that you're entering. And it's a privilege to enter it. We have to recognize this is a privileged situation. And entering the research terrain is really important because you have to know where your conversation fits in the broader conversation. And this is, like I said, this is what's referred to as the Burkean parlor. This is named after Kenneth Burke. And this is what he wrote. It's referred to as the unending conversation, which is really what the essay is. That's the essay genre. It's the research classical argument genre, and I am going to read this, so bear with me. But it is crucial to understand, and this is all a metaphor, but it's crucial to understanding what it is we're doing when we're actually writing. So imagine that you enter a parlor. You come late. When you arrive, others have long preceded you, and they are engaged in a heated discussion, a discussion too heated for them to pause and tell you exactly what it is about. In fact, the discussion had already begun long before any of them got there, so that no one present is qualified to retrace for you all the steps that had gone before. You listen for a while until you decide that you have caught the tenor of the argument. Then you put it in or. Someone answers. You answer him. Another comes to your defense. Another aligns himself against you to either the embarrassment or gratification of your opponent, depending upon the quality of your ally's assistance. However, the discussion is interminable. The hour grows late, you must depart, and you do depart, with the discussion still vigorously in progress. So that's a metaphor. This concept of this what's happening in this conversations that are happening in this parlor metaphor is what's happening in academic argumentation. There's all these conversations happening. People are coming and going. No one really knows the full landscape because the landscapes are immense. no, I mean, it's impossible to understand the full research terrains of, especially, I mean, some of them are small, um, but but a lot of them are huge, right? But you kind of can dip your toe in, and then you're like, okay, I got this. I can, I can get it enough where I can kind of put in my own argument, and then maybe someone will agree with me, and maybe they'll disagree with me. But then I gotta go, right? I can put in my argument, and I'm gonna go, but people are still gonna be talking about it. But then they're gonna have my part of the argument, and that's gonna be part of that conversation now. So you've left your mark in that conversation. So that's the Burkean parlor, this idea of the unending conversation, and that's a really important metaphor to understand in terms of the work that we do in argumentation and why it's important. And it's important for larger reasons and for cultural reasons. Um, so I do get into, so moving on, I get into specific topic choices. I just listed a few. So I say here that topics that are too broad and generally too large to be given due diligence in this short of a paper are listed below. Additionally, students in English 123 often select topics. This is speculation on my part, but I've been teaching a long time. They often select topics that they might be easier, but are, and that's because students have flat out told me this, but are in fact far more complex in nature and don't realize this, and thus their arguments and papers come off as uninformed and superficial. And I have flat out told students that. And I give examples of poor topic selections, and this is based on 17 years of teaching composition. The first four that I've bold-faced are the absolute worst: obesity, gun control, the death penalty, climate change. Horrible topics. Do not write on them. I've added free higher education, financial literacy, and student loan debt, abortion, and police brutality. Hopefully you'll see something a little bit in common with a lot of these, and that's that these are all very charged topics. One thing that's always thrown me off about Embry-Riddle, and this is the end of my third year teaching with Embry-Riddle, and before that I taught for a long time at a large state university. And so I expected these types of topics, and a lot of times I assigned topics. At Embry-Riddle, I always expect students to choose topics that are very aviation based or aerospace based or UAV based or military based, and sometimes they are. A lot of times they are. I've read a lot of stuff on those types of topics, and they're very interesting. But there's a lot of students who are choosing these types of topics that in the list that you're seeing here that I would expect from my 18 to 22-year-old students from the large state university who are coming out of high school and don't have the life experience or very specific interests that I expect from my students at Embry-Riddle. So I say these are poor topic selections not because I have problems with these topics for personal or professional reasons. I have problems with these topics because they don't make for good topics for these two papers in this particular course. Mostly because the topics cannot be given due diligence in this short of a paper. These topics are just immense. If you say, I'm going to talk about climate change, I'm like, whoa, did you get a book deal that I wasn't aware of? Like, the topic of climate change is so huge. I don't even know. Like, if I said I'm going to talk about, firstly, I would never say I'm going to talk about climate change. I would say, I'm going to talk about a very specific part of climate change. What exactly are you going to talk about? Okay. I'm going to talk about the agricultural, okay, or even more so, I'm going to talk about how the Paris Treaty's goals for the aviation industry's carbon emissions, um, uh, carbon emission. What am I trying to say? So the Paris Treaty has carbon emission goals for very specific for all industries, including the aviation industry. How does that affect, or how is that going to affect airlines and the aviation industry? Right? That means you have to look into what the Paris Treaty says, or the Paris Accord. I don't know what they call it anymore. I've talked about it so much and giving tons of feedback on bad papers on climate change. What they're saying on that specific industry, how airlines and aviation are responding to that. Is anybody doing anything about it? Because I sometimes will read a lot of papers about like, oh, let's talk about getting more planes in the air. And it's like, okay, but what about this? You know, we have to think about your in opposition to that is going to be carbon emissions. What about net zero, right? Which is a major aspect of the global north, which is consistently not meeting its goals set by and ratified by hundreds of countries around the globe. And the global, so there are a lot of, and also with this list, there are tons of political implications that students don't discuss. And I put obesity at the top because obesity, every paper, the other one I would put on here that's really problematic is social media. Anything on social media is a problem. One more. Video games. Please don't make me read another paper on video games, please. I've been reading them for so long. Obesity, and I'll give you. I have given so much feedback on obesity in America and why the papers are such a problem, and I'm gonna just talk about that again. There are no personal things I have that inform this list. It is just that these are topics that you cannot, they're too broad. It's not to say that you couldn't take, these are what we call umbrella topics. There are small pieces, like for example, with police brutality, you could, for example, just talk about body cams and the legal implications of body cams. That could be a potential paper, right? You're talking about one very specific thing that has to do with police brutality, right? So there are, within all of these, I think, maybe with the exception of like abortion, which is just, I mean, that's a real doozy. I haven't had an abortion paper in a long time. I was really hesitant to put it on this list because I was like, I haven't had an abortion paper in like 15, no, maybe like 10 years. But with the exception of maybe abortion, I think all of these have nuanced areas that you could address very effectively in a paper. So these are what we would call umbrella topics that have the potential for that you can write about these things. It's just that these by themselves don't make for good topics because they're too broad. Within them, there's tons of much narrower topics that can be discussed. So let me just give you an example with obesity. So the problem with a conversation about obesity is all of the papers I read on obesity say that obesity is a problem and can be, I'm just going to be paraphrased, can be mitigated by diet, exercise, and let's just say diet and exercise or something along those lines, right? Something like that. That is uninformed and superficial. It's highly, highly uninformed. This is because I have been reading papers on obesity for years, and I have also done a lot of my own research on obesity for 20 years. And I'm talking scientific, medical, peer-reviewed, keeping up on the research from highly credible sources. And so when someone comes at me and says, obesity is a problem that can be mitigated by diet and exercise, I'm like, no. So first of all, if that's a thesis statement, I'm going to rip it to shreds because my job as the reader and as your instructor, I'm sorry to say, is to rip your argument to shreds. Because your job as a writer is to cover all of your bases. You're supposed to build and craft a bulletproof argument, a solid, can't get here, can't get through here, I've blocked it, I've defended it, I've got the evidence, you can't get in, nope, 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 right? You're fully defending every place and I can't get in no matter how I try. My job as the reader instructor is I sit here and I look at papers and I say, cutting you off at the knees here, I'm cutting you off at the knees here, I'm ripping this to shreds, I'm shooting bullets here, 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 and it's too easy for me. And I can do it in seconds. So you want to make my job as difficult as possible. If it's like, okay, yeah, I can't, that one's hard for me. I can't put a hole in that because you've built a bulletproof argument, right? Or you're supporting it with some bulletproof evidence there. Then I can't shoot a hole through it. And I'm convinced. Then you've done your job as a writer. So the problem here is, and I bring this up in every paper on anyone, whoever talks about obesity, is that firstly, and this is again just to give examples, is that there are two types, and this is just to get into it, two types of obesity, right? There is the preventable type, meaning that you weren't genetically born with an issue like obesity. Like maybe you grew up more slender and then you ended up becoming obese later in life. And then there's the type that they refer to as a disease, meaning that you are genetically predisposed to being obese. From all the medical and scientific peer-reviewed scholarly articles I've read, obesity as a disease is not preventable. So anyone who says that obesity can be mitigated by diet and exercise, bullet number one. You're not talking about obesity in a way that it should be talked about, and they never do. They never say, they just kind of lump obesity as this one issue, not as various issues that are, well, there are some people who become obese through time and the weight can easily be dropped because they're not genetically predisposed to it, versus those people who genuinely struggle with it because they are genetically predisposed to it. And also, they don't talk about the word obesity itself, which has a lot to do with the problem of the BMI algorithm. So what I also bring up is the problem of the BMI algorithm. I bring this up in every single paper that talks about obesity. I give feedback to them on to every paper, and nobody ever talks about it because I think I give this feedback and they have no idea what to do with it because I have completely shut down their argument, and without having to trash their entire paper and rewrite with a new topic, they just ignore it. So the problem of the BMI algorithm is that it's 200 years old. It was created by a mathematician to help the government understand how to allocate resources. And the inventor told the government, the US government, not to use it to measure obesity. So what does the government do? Uses it to measure obesity. Okay. Yeah, should we be surprised? I don't know. Probably not. So the BMI in itself is how the government measures obesity. So its problem. So the BMI algorithm has, for decades upon decades, been a contentious issue in the topic of obesity. It is scientifically and physiologically, I can't spell physiologically, problematic. Also because it was created by a mathematician and not a doctor or a physiologist, somebody who would say, here's how we can actually measure. Like, I'm somebody who understands the body and not just math. It's considered racist because of the way that it's measured. So there's also a racist aspect to the BMI algorithm. And the way that it measures the body is just there's just so many arguments out there from highly credible sources that say, including science, medicine, psychology, anthropology, that says the BMI is ridiculous. Get rid of it. And also with the BMI algorithm, athletes, not all of them. There are a lot of athletes who are considered obese. And not just athletes, but anybody who has, a specific body type, depending on what weighs more in a body, in a physiological structure like a body, they're considered obese. It makes zero sense biologically, physiologically. So the very thing we're talking about, obesity, and when we say the word obese, that word is designated by a particular mathematical algorithm that has been proven for decades to be a completely null and void problematic entity, even though the medical industry still uses it, and even though the medical industry has said this is a problem, and even though tons of other disciplines have come in and said this is a problem, it's what the federal government continues to say, no, we're going to keep using it, even though they were told by the inventor, a mathematician, don't use this to measure obesity. I am calculating this to help you understand how to allocate food resources. Another thing that people often don't talk about when it comes to obesity is something like food deserts. There's these things called food deserts out there. Food deserts are places in America that exist very far away from either supermarkets, and it costs a lot to have food shipped out to these places. And so by the time that, say, quote unquote, healthier food makes it to them, the cost of that food is higher due to the amount of travel it's taken to get to them. So there's these food deserts out there. So because of that, there's what we call a positive correlation. There's higher obesity rates in these areas due to the lack of healthier foods. I always put healthy and healthy in quotation marks because define healthy for me. That's my other note about the conversation about obesity is everybody likes to talk about it's healthy. Well, talk to me about what healthy means. I don't know what it means. It means something different for each person. Don't define it. It's what we call an overdetermined word, meaning that it's been so used so many times, it's void of meaning. Don't use the word healthy. If you want to use it, put it in what we call scare quotes, like I have done here. So it's due to the lack of healthier foods. So so numerous studies have been done in these food deserts where they have done what's called tax subsidies. So they've subsidized healthier foods, like fruits and vegetables, to see if the people living in food deserts would buy fruits and vegetables. And do you know what happened? They didn't buy them. So, what does that mean? That's a cultural issue, right? You can't just say that, or you can't just say, hey, here's a problem. We have a bunch of food deserts in America because we're a big country. And we're just going to chuck a bunch of fruits and vegetables at them and expect that they're just going to change their entire way of existing. And hopefully their obesity rates will go down. So we look better as a country, even though we've culturally instantiated them to be a certain way, right? This is a cultural problem, meaning America has a particular culture when it comes to food, which I can also corroborate with America being a meat-eating country, which I can trace back to very recent reports on America and other global north country exceeding its carbon emission rates for meat products, and that it is eating more meat than it's supposed to based on, again, the Paris Treaty, because we're supposed to be slowly moving to more plant-based foods in order to get our carbon emissions down, yet America is saying, no, we don't want to do that, right? So that's a hypocritical statement, right? So we're talking about obesity, yet the majority of the country still wants to eat meat, which is a highly problematic food for a variety of reasons, not to mention the climate change issue. So there's all these problems wrapped up in this. And then you can also bring in the issue of body discrimination, body shaming. Anytime we talk about obesity and we talk about like, hey, you need to diet and exercise, you're having these unstated assumptions of you're fat, you got a bad body, right? You're not saying it, but you're presuming it. And also people like to talk about comorbidities, but they don't talk about them as comorbidities. They'll say like, "Oh, you're obese, so you're gonna have diabetes too. You're gonna you're not gonna live as long of a life. You're gonna have heart disease. You're gonna have strokes." Okay, these are what we call comorbidities in the medical industry. So again, all of those things need evidence. We need statistics. So that doesn't happen for everybody, but that's also a lot of fallacious logic happening because maybe some people are fine with that. Maybe some people are like, you know what? If I want to be fat and and I'll give you two examples that are personal. I had my great aunt was a smoker her entire life. She was diagnosed with emphysema, and she smoked cigarettes until the day she died because she was like, try not allowing me to smoke. I'm 85 years old and I don't care. I'm going to die. I'm going to do what I love until I die. My mom has liver disease, and I have fought with her about drinking alcohol, and she finally said, I'm going to die. This is what I like. Leave me alone. And I said, you know what? Okay, you're right. If this is what you want to do until you die, have at it. You're old. You can do it. So sometimes people just are going to do what they're going to do. So there's a lot of like, what we call externalizing and projection that's happening in these types of arguments that are unstated assumptions, presumptions that come off as really pretentious and frankly don't belong in these types of papers. And that's not to mention all of the or not statistical, but all of the kind of just basic troubling information that I've brought up, and that's just really the tip of the iceberg when it comes to here's why an umbrella topic like obesity is an issue. You know, if anything, I would say write about the problem of the BMI algorithm. That's a paper right there. You know, so not obesity can be solved by a diet and exercise. No, it can't. I'm sorry to tell you, if it could, we'd all be skinny. And we'd all be skinny forever. And also, what is this equation with skinny equals healthy? That gets into a whole nother conversation. So it's like there's too many conversations to be had over these umbrella topics. The same goes for gun control. Too large of an umbrella topic. Not to say that there's not smaller topics under that can't be made into an argumentative paper. Right? Same thing, maybe with the death penalty. Again, death penalty and abortion are probably the two most charged topics on here because they are so wrapped up in religion. So that's why I'm saying so anything that's super wrapped up in religion and politics at the same time, it's really hard to write about because sometimes it's really hard to separate those things out. And those are probably, I mean, you can separate them out, but that's why I'm saying they're probably two of the most difficult things to write about. Climate change, tons of things, great umbrella topic, but you can't just write on climate change, right? A million little topics under climate change that you could pick and choose that are super narrow. Social media, ugh. Just don't. Video games, same thing, don't. There's so many things about video games. I'm a gamer myself. I play Xbox. I play it every day. I love it. There's so many things about video games that are fascinating that people don't talk about. People always want to talk about the violence. It's like that's such an old conversation. I'm an OG gamer. Like I grew up with Atari, and I've been hearing these conversations about violence in gaming my whole life. So reading student papers in 2021 about violence in gaming, I'm like, is this conversation still happening? Like, is it still a thing? I'm pretty sure the uh, the ratings on gaming, like that's a thing now. Conversation over. Um, but there's so many interesting things happening and that have been happening in the world of gaming that are far more interesting to argue about than old cliche arguments than violence in gaming or games and educational um, benefits of them. Like those are old hat. We don't want to do old hat arguments either. Same goes for social media. Social media has been around a long time. Facebook, okay, 2003. I was one of the first. I was an early adopter. I was there. I was on it when I had to have a university email. It's an old. I'm dating myself, but I'm old. It's an old social media thing. So yeah, we get it. Bullying. It happens in real life. It happens online. Okay. Yeah. So, um, I just don't, you know, social media. I've, I just don't know what else there is to say about social media. Like what arguments can be made that are actually new and interesting. I know all the old ones. They're all old hat to me at this point. Self-esteem, bullying, lack of connection, building connections. I'm an active externalist, I talk about I do the work I do on I don't talk about social media. I write about mobile devices as human prosthetics and that they are actually metacognitive devices. They extend the human consciousness. So that's what I talk about in terms of social media and social devices. So that's what we call active externalism. It's a theory and a philosophy. So um, that and that has to do with embodiment and, like I said, metacognition. But you know, there there's things again. There's things to talk about within all of these, but you have to be aware of just knowing how to narrow it down and how to make it interesting. Being aware of, firstly, I would say write about something in your field. Don't write about these, what are relatively generic topics. Like, focus on something that's in what you're studying and do that because that's going to be helpful for your future classes at Embry-Riddle. That would be my first and foremost tip to you, and then narrow that down super specifically. So that's everything. I know this is probably a long video, but I did want to talk about like topics and what's appropriate and what's not, and why this type of stuff is important to really think about, and why we don't just select topics just like, yeah, whatever, it's a topic, it'll be easier, or not. It's not easier. All topics have their levels of ease and levels of complexity. So there's no such thing as an easy topic. Trust me. So let me know if you have any questions or are having difficulties in choosing a topic, or maybe you're like, is this topic too broad or too narrow? Because you can have too narrow of a topic as well. I've been there. I've been in both. Trust me, I've had too broad of topics. I've had too narrow of topics. I've been all over the board. So when you've done it as long as I have. So don't hesitate to reach out with any questions. Otherwise, that's all I got for now.